council to order. Please rise for the prayer, pledge of allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, as a body we congregate in this council chamber. We pray for thy divine guidance, that we may do all things well, according to thy holy will. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Braden, would you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Bonsall.
Here.
Mr. Gabbard.
Here.
Mr. Geraci.
Here.
Mr. Kelsch.
Here.
Mr. DiNardo.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden. Here.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Item E, amendment of agenda. The only amendment we have this evening is item I, reports of standing committees of council. We are going to remove the Parks, Recreation, and Public Spaces committee report. May I have a motion? Mr. Kelsch? A motion to amend. Motion by Mr. Kelsch, second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonsall.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelsch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden. Yes.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item F, minutes of previous meeting. We do not have any this evening. Moving on to item H, request to address council. This evening we have Mr. John Moore.
Good evening, gentlemen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So my name is John Moore. I'm of 2432 Hudson Avenue. I'm here tonight representing a group of about 25 residents that over the weekend delivered against something that I presented to both the Parks and Rec Subcommittee back in May and this council in July. That being a beautification project at the corner of Hudson and Floral Ave, just on the tree lawn there. Sort of known as the micro park. This project was 6-7 months in the making. I was very pleased. We had about 25 volunteers come, and over the course of 12 hours on Saturday and Sunday, we tilled up a lot of grass, put in a flower bed, assembled some benches, a receptacle, and installed all these things in the ground. Got some trees in that we're excited to have grow bigger over time. And overall, it was just a wonderful event. I will follow up with you guys and share some pictures and whatnot so that you can see the finished product. But anytime you'd like, swing by 2301 Hudson Avenue. That's sort of the most direct address there at the corner of Hudson and Floral. And have a sit and hopefully meet some new neighbors and enjoy yourself on a nice day. So that's really it, and I thank you all for your blessing and in pursuing it, and I'm excited to have it implemented. So if you all have any questions, I'm glad to field those, but otherwise, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thanks.
Next request, Pastor Sonny James.
Pastor Sonny James, 1830 Hopkins Avenue. I want to first send my condolences and prayers out for the families in our community that are still experiencing battles with COVID-19. We pray successful and healthy recovery, and pray that their families and friends will show them much needed support during this time. I want to share that recently I have become aware of the mental health effects that all of the focus on racial issues cause. And so to my family first and peers, I want to make sure that I always do what is in the best interest of those that I love. So recently it's become aware to me and made known to me after counsel, talking with professionals and my peers, that I had not realized being on the forefront of a lot of the racial issues, even here in Norwood for years, really can take its toll. So for that, I have a responsibility to myself, of course, and to God, and to my peers, and to my community, to make sure that I do the things necessary to make sure I show every child in my community how to get difficult things accomplished. I want to personally thank Michael Gabbard, Councilman Gabbard, because on the last council meeting, I was really having a difficult time. And it's no surprise to me how I believe he will be the face of our leadership moving forward. Because until we can publicly address the concerns of black people, I truly believe it's going to be very difficult to avoid the outbursts of good, honest, loving, caring people who just get fed up with the same status quo. So I'm encouraging those. I also want to make sure that I acknowledge Chris Kelsch, who has done a phenomenal job of trying to support me and things that concern people like me. I want to make sure that I have not always, I think, publicly mentioned Mr. Geraci has shown a great deal of support. And that would not be fair for me to stand publicly and not give honor to where honor is due. And Eric DiNardo, who has done the same. And I really appreciate, the fact that we can spend a lot of money on Narcan, and our legal department can support that for those family members and friends of yours that get hooked on heroin. But my challenge is, what do you do to prioritize the initiatives of black people and the causes of mental health? I just want everybody to be safe. But when time after time after time, I'm confronted with things that look bad, or every time a black man or woman come up with a great idea right in our faces, white people seem to think that they can just steal the ideas, and our folks in our community seem to support them, including from our mayor. Let's be safe. Let's be healthy. Black lives matter, and all lives matter.
Thank you, Pastor James. That concludes our request to address council. Moving on to item J, third reading of ordinances, resolutions. J1, ordinance establishing the Norwood Arts Board. Mr. Thompson.
Move we have the third and final reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson, have the third and final reading. You have a second, Mr. DiNardo. Thank you. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonson?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye. 7-0. Mr. Braden, may we have the third reading?
Ordinance establishing the Norwood Arts Board.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Thompson.
We'll move that we pass this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. Bonzo.
I'll second the ordinance.
Second by Mr. Bonzo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to J2, ordinance amending Chapter 1321 of the Norwood Codified Ordinance to allow murals in certain areas of the city of Norwood A. Mr. Tracy.
I'd like to make a motion to table this ordinance.
We have a motion by Mr. Geraci to table the ordinance. Mr. Kelly?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Mr. Bonds?
Well, it's his motion, so he would.
I'm sorry. Mr. Geraci.
The reason I look to table this one, at least for right now, is that I'd like to put it in the hands of the voters. Let them decide whether or not we should have an ordinance like this on the books. I think that it's divided this community in such a way that I think that it should go to the ballot at some point, whether it be earlier or later. But let the residents have a full say in it.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Mr. Bonds?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I would recommend that we vote no on this motion for the following reasons. First, the voters elected us, the seven of us, to kind of make decisions on their behalf in the sense of creating ordinances, creating laws. And, if this is divisive to some, and if members of council feel like we should not approve this, then, I would recommend voting no on the ordinance if that's how they feel. The second thing is, I think if we do vote on this ordinance today and it doesn't pass, I don't think we really need to worry too hard, because I think it will appear on the ballot at some point in the future in the same way that the Norwood Cannabis Ordinance appeared on the ballot. So I would recommend that we just dispense with this ordinance, just vote it up or down. But I would recommend, though, that we vote the motion no, because I think we should just deal with this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Mr. DiNardo?
Yeah, I couldn't, whether you or Keith Moore, Mr. Moore, could you explain how that would work if it were to vote? If we voted no, when and what process would it end up on the ballot and then achieve what I think you're hoping for anyway?
Mr. Moore? Question for Mr.
How would that work?
Council could vote to put something on the ballot as an issue for the voters to decide. We've done it for a couple of things. We did it for how many council members we would have. For this, I'm assuming we could do it for an issue like that. Council could do that for an issue like this. The alternative is if council doesn't do anything with these ordinances, then registered voters in Norwood can get enough signatures to have an issue put on the ballot.
I see.
Or if council passes one of these, somebody could get enough signatures to put a challenge to that on the ballot to overturn it. And I would just say, in regards to putting it on the ballot, the question, my issue would be what would be on the ballot, because council has had a lot of division on exactly what the terms of a mural ordinance would be to begin with. So I'm just raising that process would be slightly, whatever proposal it is it going to include this district, that district, what are the sizes, that kind of thing, is something that would have to be resolved by whichever method it was, whatever the ballot initiative was, whatever the language of that was, could involve some complications. So I'm just pointing that out. As sounds easy, but it may not be that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Dracy.
And I understand, Mr. Bonzel, that we are elected by the residents, but we are elected by 2,500 residents, or we are elected by how many residents voted that election term. We weren't voted in by 600 residents or 400 residents or 200 residents. We were voted in by residents on both sides of this this issue at this point. So for us to try to vote on something that is so divisive within the community, I think we just need to allow the residents to decide on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Dracy. Mr. Kelch?
Thank you, Mr. President. I support tabling this ordinance. We're voted by the residents to make tough decisions, but that doesn't mean we always have to in certain instances. It's something as divisive as this, I think it's a smart tactical move to allow the residents to have their voices heard clearly, directly, rather than our opinions, whether they're loaded opinions, whether they're fair opinions. To me, this is a move of solid leadership to ask the constituents, what do you guys really, truly want? Especially in a time like COVID, where a lot of them don't feel comfortable coming here and being heard. We're not getting email pulls from hundreds of residents, but I think us keeping this alive and putting this on the ballot for the residents to come out and vote on, I think is a smart move here. And I would really urge the rest of the council to share in that and vote that way.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any further discussion? The motion on the floor is to table the ordinance. We have a motion by Mr. Geraci, second by Mr. Kelch. Mr. Braden, please call the roll.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bonzel?
No.
Mr. Gabbard?
No.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Braden is a yes.
All members present, we have 4 noes, 3 yeses. Motion fails.
I think,
Mr. Thompson.
Motion, we have the third and final reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to have the third and final reading. We have a second. Mr. Bonsall. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have the third reading?
Yes, sir. Ordinance amending Chapter 1321 of the Norwood Codified Ordinance to allow murals in certain areas of the city of Norwood.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall to pass the ordinance. Mr. Thompson?
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I would just say that we've spent so much time on murals at this point already. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of things have happened. It's already been stated that, you know, this is essentially a no vote here and a yes vote on the ordinance B could basically mean that we could explore next June or in some months. I think June was mentioned at some point, but at some point next year we would open up the topic again and explore neighborhood business districts. And I would just challenge, you know, council members to realize that when we do that, we're going to have to, I mean, there's going to be quite a bit of time spent on this topic again. So, you know, I would just encourage a yes vote on ordinance A so that we can just get this off the agenda and get this done with and focus on the issues at hand. So, I'll have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Gabbard?
Before we vote on either of these, I wanted to take just a minute to, first of all, thank the committee for all the time that we spent on this. You guys did a good job, and we heard from a lot of people. And so with that, I want to apologize. I didn't do a good job as a chairperson, especially with this particular topic. I want to apologize to my committee, to this council, and to our citizens. I personally probably I had some misunderstanding about some things in this. I didn't communicate properly like I should. And it's definitely been a learning experience for me, and I commit that I will try to do better and work on those things to be able to move us forward. So regardless of which way we vote on these tonight, hopefully we're going to have something started that we can move forward on. And so I just wanted to apologize because I don't feel that I did a good job in leading this as the chairperson, and wanted to offer that up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Mr. Thompson?
Appreciate your apology, but I don't really think you need to apologize. I think you did a great job taking this through. Sometimes we make mistakes and we don't get the things exactly the way that we want. But we've spent a lot of time on this, and we've all had eyes on it. And don't be hard on yourself.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
No.
Mr. Dracy?
No.
Mr. Kelch?
No.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a no.
All members present voting, we have 4 noes, 3 yeses. Motion fails. Moving on to item J3, ordinance amending Chapter 1321 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances to allow murals in certain areas of the city of Norwood B. Mr. Thompson.
Move we have third and final reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to have the third and final reading of the ordinance. I have a second. Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Mr. Dracy.
Nope, never mind.
Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have the third reading?
Yes, sir. Ordinance amending Chapter 1321 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances to allow murals in certain areas of the city of Norwood.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. DiNardo.
Make a motion to vote to pass the ordinance.
Second by Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel,
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard,
Yes.
Mr. Dracy,
Yes.
Mr. Kelch,
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a no.
All members present, we have 6 yeses, 1 no. The motion passes. Moving on to item K, second reading of ordinances and resolutions. Item K1, resolution accepting the amounts and rates as determined by the Budget Commission and authorizing the necessary tax levies and certifying them to the county auditor. Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to have both the second and the third reading on this.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have the second and third reading. Mr. Thompson.
I'll second that.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel,
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard,
Yes.
Mr. Dracy,
Yes.
Mr. Kelch,
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have the second and third reading?
Yes, sir. Resolution accepting the amounts and rates as determined by the Budget Commission and authorizing the necessary tax levies and certifying them to the county auditor. Resolution accepting the amounts and rates as determined by the Budget Commission and authorizing the necessary tax levies and certifying them to the county auditor.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Bonzel.
I move that we pass the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzel. Mr. DiNardo.
Second.
Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bonzel,
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard,
Yes.
Mr. Dracy,
Yes.
Mr. Kelch,
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden, yes.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item K2, ordinance enacting new chapter 567 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances entitled Chronic Nuisances and declaring an emergency. Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to make a motion to have second and third reading on this.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to have the second and third reading. Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to point out, like last time we talked about this, last meeting, we have a severe nuisance property problem in Norwood. This ordinance that we spent a long time ironing out, working with members of the committee, members of the community, landlords, property owners alike, and taking their advice and turning this into a complete ordinance, something that I think personally will go very far in helping Norwood curb the problem of nuisance properties. So again, I would urge that the members of council vote for this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any further discussion? Mr. Braden, will you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Mr. Bonzel,
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard,
Yes.
Mr. Dracy,
Yes.
Mr. Kelch,
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have the second and third reading?
Yes, sir. Ordinance enacting new chapter 567 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances entitled Chronic Nuisances and declaring an emergency. Ordinance enacting new chapter 567 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances entitled Chronic Nuisances and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. May I have a motion, gentlemen? Mr. Kelch?
Make a motion to pass this ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Kelch. Mr. Geraci.
I'll second the motion.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden is a yes.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item L, introductory reading of ordinances and resolutions. Item L1, ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement between the City of Norwood and the Board of Hamilton County Commissioners relative to the improvement of Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
We can have the first reading, please. That's my motion.
Mr. DiNardo, you would like to have the first reading? That's your motion? Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have the first reading. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was hoping, I don't know if the mayor has any information on this ordinance. If so, I was hoping that we could hear more, the public could hear more information about it.
Mayor Schneider.
Yeah, this gives the city the ability to take advantage of $100,000 to make repairs, improvements to Montgomery Road. Sooner we get the money, the sooner we can work on getting this all squared away and improve the street.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Mr. Thompson.
Another question for the mayor, just, is this a time-sensitive ordinance? Do we need to pass it tonight?
Mayor Schneider.
Well, it's money coming into the city. We'd like to have it in place. We'd like to make the improvements on Montgomery Road as quickly as we can. We've got a lot of road resurfacing work going on right now. So the sooner we approve it, the sooner we can fix the roads. So I always consider that to be something that's important to the community and we'd like to do sooner than later. Yes.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Mr. DiNardo.
Given that that does actually feel like a time sensitivity of some degree, I'd make a motion, or I'd amend my motion if you will.
Yeah, I'll amend.
Motion, should we amend in your motion have suspend the rules and have all three readings?
Yes, please.
Mr. Thompson as well.
Yes.
So we have a motion by Mr. DiNardo, a second by Mr. Thompson to have all three readings. Any further discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a question through the chair to the mayor, if possible. In this work that's going to be done, is there any chance that traffic flow will be permanently altered, whereas are there going to be anything added or any streets changed so that you can't turn left at a certain street or can't turn right at a certain street with this specific program?
No. Out of this $100,000, this is repair work that will be done to remove a lot of the challenges on the street right now, which is the road surface. It's not any engineering or redesign. $100,000 doesn't go very far on Montgomery Road.
I understand. Thank you. That answers my question.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Geraci.
Are we sure we want to have three readings? I mean, we don't want to have one reading and do separate readings so that people can come out and voice support or against this? I mean, it seems like that seems to be the trend around here is.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Mr. DiNardo?
I could just provide, I guess, why I wanted to amend to go to 3. I think the point that $100,000 doesn't go very far actually hit home for me. And so it feels like any risk of it being negatively affecting any residents in any way seems low. We also heard him explain what the projects will be working on. So it doesn't feel like, to me, there was a whole lot to be debated. So that's the reason I went to 3 readings.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just note that, I think there could be times, and this could be one of them, where a council member or two might feel like, we need to give this more readings, and I definitely would recommend that they vote no to do all 3 readings if they feel that way.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mr. Geraci.
I appreciate the comments. I'm just kind of wondering, how we, I guess we do a coin flip on whether or not we're going to vote all three readings one night and have one reading another night. But, I didn't hear any specific adjustments or improvements that were being made to Montgomery Road. I mean, are we going to fix the hole that's at Hopkins and Montgomery? Are we going to repair all the curbs? Are we going to put new storm sewers in? Are we going to narrow the street down? All I heard was, here's $100,000, let's go improve it. But
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Any further discussion? Mr. Braden, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Tracy.
yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden is a yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have all three readings?
Yes, sir. Ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter an agreement between the City of Norwood and the Board of Hamilton County Commissioners relative to the improvement of Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement between the City of Norwood and the Board of Hamilton County Commissioners relative to the improvement of Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency. Ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement between the City of Norwood and the Board of Hamilton County Commissioners relative to the improvement of Montgomery Road and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonzo to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden is a yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Moving on to item L2, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to have all three readings, please.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have all three readings. May I have a second? Mr. Bonsall?
I'd like to second that. Thank you.
Second by Mr. Bonsall. Any discussion? Mr. DiNardo?
To explain for any council members why I went three readings. There is a time sensitivity to this. Specifically, we can't pay the school district until the appropriations are made. So that's why on this one, we should vote for three readings.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Mr. Braden, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have all three readings, please?
Yes, sir. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Mr. Braden, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard.
Yes.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to item L3, resolution authorizing the use of COVID relief funds to reimburse the City of Norwood for payroll expenses incurred for COVID-related manpower from March 1st, 2020 to December 30th, 2020. Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move that we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mr. Bonsall to suspend the rules and have all three readings. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo?
Thank you.
Any discussion? Mr. Braden, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mr. Braden, may we have all three readings?
Yes, sir. Resolution authorizing the use of COVID relief funds to reimburse the city of Norwood for payroll expenses incurred for COVID-related manpower from March 1st, 2020 to December 30th, 2020. Resolution authorizing the use of COVID relief funds to reimburse the city of Norwood for payroll expenses incurred for COVID-related manpower from March 1st, 2020 to December 30th, 2020. Resolution authorizing the use of COVID relief funds to reimburse the city of Norwood for payroll expenses incurred for COVID-related manpower from March 1st, 2020 to December 30th, 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. DiNardo?
I'd make a motion we vote to pass.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo.
Resolution.
May I have a second? Mr. Bonsall?
I'll second, thank you.
Motion, second by Mr. Bonsall. Any discussion? Mr. DiNardo?
Just didn't want the council or the mayor to repeat himself, but this was a follow-on from the report out that you had last council meeting when we were authorized to use some of those funds to pay some of the payroll for people who were workers of the city during the code. So it is something you already discussed, but if you had any more you wanted to add, feel free.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mayor Schneider? Anything to add, sir?
No, I mean, I think you
Yeah, thanks.
said pretty much what.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting aye, motion passes. Moving on to item L4, resolution declaring the necessity of levying a tax for current operating expenses in excess of the 10 mil limitation and requesting the county auditor to certify matters in connection therewith and declaring an emergency. Mr. Bonds.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would make a motion that we refer this resolution to the committee of the whole. I do think that there are some debate that could be had about whether we should renew this levy or potentially replace it with a street levy or some other targeted levy. So I would like us to see this discussed in the committee of the whole, so that's my motion.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. We have a motion by Mr. Bonsall to refer this to the committee of the whole. Do I have a second? Mr. Thompson?
A second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, so just so that citizens are aware, and I did have a question, I guess, to either the law director or the mayor or whoever can answer it. It had on here that, or any other council member for that matter, it had on here that this was targeted for the primary in 2021. And traditionally we don't have a primary and there's not very much on the ballot. So I was just curious, before we vote, if we could just hear that, because I'm not sure why we would do it for the primary. So all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Mayor Schneider?
Typically, and I think that the law director will tell you that this is true. Typically, the city has put this on in the primary so that if there is a challenge, if there's something going on and it doesn't pass, this has been funds that the city needed desperately, operating funds that the city needed desperately to keep its head above water. So it was put on early. If it passed, it passed. If it didn't pass, we had an opportunity to sit down and scratch our heads and figure out what would work in the future. And the way that the tax is actually applied, it's happening at a different time. So that's why it was done this way in the past. And that's why I would recommend it's done that way again. But, you know, if it goes into the committee of the whole and there's discussion, that's council's prerogative, absolutely.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Any further discussion? Mr. DiNardo?
Yeah. Your comment is what I was going to say earlier, but I just wanted to check on timeline. I had in my notes, in order to kind of work backwards from that target of the primaries, that would suggest we have quite a few months before we actually need to submit February or whatever, or March, to get it on the ballot. If that's correct, and I think I could support going to the committee of the whole, I just want to make sure that that timing is right. Do we have a few months? I don't know if that's either one of you two.
Mr. Moore, Mayor Schneider?
I don't know what the exact timeline is. We've always, this is to get it, this is to go to the auditors to tell us, to give us information. So we are ahead of the game right now, but it's just telling us what we can do. It's a preliminary step. I would say pass this, and then you would discuss what they come back with in the committee of the whole to say, what does the city need to operate, and do we want to do it a different way? So
yeah, I actually would agree, and I wonder, James or you, that was a bit of a light bulb for me, that I think specifically we're just asking the state or the county, thank you. We're asking the county to do the same process or a similar process that we did last council meeting for the current year. So if that's the case, then I think we can still go forward doing that and still have a discussion, because we haven't done anything other than request for information. That actually probably sounds like probably the better plan, to do both of those things in tandem. You guys are cool.
Mr. Bonzo?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I just have a question about the resolution. So it says in the caption that it says in the caption it's levying a tax it's basically declaring the necessity for levying a tax for current operating expenses. So my question is, if we want to do this for basically if we want to target this just for streets, will we have to pass a new one of these resolutions and say we have to declare the necessity for levying a tax for street expenses?
Mr. Moore?
The short answer is yes. Basically what you're doing is you're saying if we were to do a levy of this many mills for this purpose, how much would it bring in? Basically what the county does, adds up all the property, says this is how much money you'll bring in, and this is how much you'll pay on $100,000 worth of house. Mm-hmm. And they certify those numbers and they send them back to council. So if you want to do a streets levy, they would do it differently. And if you did a streets levy, odds are it actually, for a new levy, this is a renewal, so the calculation is different on new mills raise a completely different amount of money than a renewal of something that was there before. So it would be different math altogether. And so you'd send something to the county to say, we want to do a 2-mill street levy, we want to do a 1-mill street levy. So yeah, you would need an entirely separate resolution to do that. And then it would come back to council, and council could decide to then request to put it on the ballot.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. So, I think that we still, if we have a committee of the whole meeting, which I think don't want to spoil the surprise, but I think there will be one next week. I think we're still going to have more than enough time because I think the final thing has to be to the county auditor. The election's May 4th, so I think it's 90 days before. Usually it's like early August when we put these things on for a general election. I think we've got time to wait to talk about this at the committee of the whole and kind of figure out where we want to go with this personally. I'm not really comfortable at this point. This is an emergency levy that's been renewed in 5-year increments since GM left. And I don't personally know if this emergency levy is still needed. And so I wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily voting yes on this today. But I would just ask that potentially that we wait 2 weeks, and if at that point, if there's no progress on anything other than this, then we move forward at that point, and I'll commit to voting yes on that to at least get the numbers, if we don't decide to do something else.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzel. Any further discussion? Mr. DiNardo?
I understand your thought process, and it's not the worst. I still kind of would prefer the way I had it, but it is worth noting that it's over $1 million, so it'd be hard to, I think, operate without this. So it can't be in my mind, a removal. It would have to be if not this, then that, which may be what you're saying with the streets levy. You would be changing the purpose, but I don't think we should go into this thinking that we should remove the need for the emergency levy. It's quite a substantial number that keeps us barely over the operating budget that we've had trouble doing anyway. Just worth reminding, I suppose.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Brady?
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate everybody's input here, and I respect your opinion, Mr. Bonzel, but I would just ask that we vote no to put this in the committee of the whole, and that we pass this tonight. I think there's a need, so I would just ask my fellow councilmen to follow along with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Any further discussion? The motion on the floor by Mr. Bonzel, second by Mr. Thompson, is to refer this to the committee of the whole. Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
No.
Mr. Kelch?
No.
Mr. DiNardo?
No.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a no.
All members present, we have 4 noes, 3 yeses, forgive me. So the motion fails. Mr. DiNardo?
I'd like to make a motion to have all 3 readings.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to have all 3 readings. Mr. Geraci?
I'll second the motion.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Any discussion? Mr. DiNardo?
Just a bit of discussion that I would still like it to go to the committee of the whole. I don't know if we do that in the new business to make sure that we do talk about it, and I think there is enough time. I just like the parallel option that we're trying to, that my 3 readings is trying to pursue.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Mr. Bonzel?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I am going to be voting no on this motion to do all 3 readings. I mean, we haven't had it hasn't been in Finance Committee, it hasn't been in any other committee, before coming up. So I do think that there's more discussion that could be had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzel. Mr. Geraci?
I will be voting yes on this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci.
And the reason I will be voting yes on this motion is that discussion can be had even after it's voted on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzel?
No.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes? Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present, we have 6 yeses, 1 no. Motion passes. Mr. Braden.
Resolution declaring the necessity of levying a tax for current operating expenses in the excess of the 10 mil limitation and requesting the county auditor to certify matters in connection therewith and declaring an emergency. Resolution declaring the necessity of levying a tax for current operating expenses in excess of the 10 mil limitation and requesting the county auditor to certify matters in connection therewith and declaring an emergency. Resolution declaring the necessity of levying a tax for current operating expenses in excess of the 10 mil limitation and requesting the county auditor to certify matters in connection therewith and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. May I have a motion? Mr. DiNardo?
And motion that we vote to pass the resolution.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo. May I have a second? Mr. Geraci?
Second that motion.
Second by Mr. Geraci. Any further discussion? Mr. Bonzel?
Thank you, Mr. President. And I know that I hear Mr. Dracy's enthusiastic concern about, or enthusiastic statement that we can still do this in a parallel path, and for sure that can still happen. My worry here is just, I really think that we have Finance Committee for a reason. I think that we have committees for a reason. I think that we should be more strategic when we're talking about things like this. We've had surpluses in our budget the last couple of years that have been pretty substantial. And not that those will always carry forward, but to not actually look at this in a systematic way and just assume that we're going to need additional dollars, even though this is not putting it on the ballot, I think it's the wrong move overall. So, like I said, I'll be voting no on this, but I do look forward to the future discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Any further discussion? Mr. Darden?
Just to be incredibly clear, that the resolution is to instruct a request to the county for confirmation of the rates. We would still have all of our discussion, and I just want to be incredibly clear to everyone that this resolution is not doing anything except getting clarity and confirmation on the rates that would come back to us.
Thank you, Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Mr. Braden, please call the roll.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bonzo?
No.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting. We have 6 yeses, 1 no. Motion passes. Moving on to item M, unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished business, gentlemen? Mr. Dracy.
I'd like to call a Law and Ordinance Committee meeting on November 9th at 7 p.m., council chambers, if members are able to attend.
That was November 9th, 7:30?
7.
7. Thank you, Mr. Dracy. Any other unfinished business? Mr. Kelch.
Well, I'm not sure if this is the time yet, but I would like to thank the mayor for some information he gave me on the Elm Avenue project and updates. I know it's something we talked about, it's not finished yet, so figured this is the right section of the meeting. But I would like to thank him and Mr. Murphy for putting the letter out and making sure I have that information, and reading my emails when I send them to request stuff like this so that the residents can stay informed on what's going on, and hopefully working towards a solution within the coming months, years, and making sure that they're taken care of. So I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Any other unfinished business? Then we'll move on to new business. Any new business? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to thank all of the organizers and the volunteers from the Norwood Historic Home Tour. So that happened about a week and a half ago, and I think it was a pretty big success. We basically kind of walked around just a different, it was a walking tour basically of a few streets on South Norwood, and I know that the volunteers, they put a lot of time. They had these big binders full of information, and it was impossible in the 60 or so minute tour to get through all of it, but you know, they passed on a whole ton of information that I didn't know about. So I know that there's interest in, I've heard people have ideas of doing like the Indian Mound section next and doing other places for the outdoor kind of walking tour aspect of it, and just wish them the best and thank them for all their work.
Any other new business? Mr. Brady.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. I would like to call a Streets and Infrastructure Committee meeting, and that would be a Tuesday, November the 3rd. And one of the topics would be traffic calming, Carthage Avenue and Quatman Avenue. And I'd probably add a few things to the agenda. So I'd like to welcome anyone who wants to come and have their input in those situations I just mentioned. Any other ones, contact me and we can add to the agenda as needed.
Time?
What time did you say, John?
I didn't, 6:30?
Election days, the polls still be open.
Say it again?
It's election day. The
Oh,
poll.
that's election day. How about Monday the 2nd?
You working the polls?
Say it again.
Are you working the polls?
No, I'm not. You want to do election night? That's fine with me, yeah.
I'm not on the committee yet.
Okay. Yeah, I
It might be better for me to.
Why are you picking on me tonight? Do you want to have a meeting or not?
I could do,
So,
Monday,
yeah, okay,
yeah.
look, let's not have it on election night. I didn't realize that. I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor. So let's go Monday the 2nd. Let's go Monday the 2nd at 6:30, if anybody has any issues with that.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Kelch?
Oh, I just wanted to ask if I could, through the chair, to Mr. Braden, are we going to be talking about a potential streets plan going forward? Are we going to be? having
We
that
can
conversation?
add that to the agenda, sure. I mean,
I didn't hear exactly what you were saying.
basically, the agenda would be traffic calming on Carthage and Quatman, and I'd like to, we will add to that. So yeah, we can put in a street plan and exactly what's happening right now with that. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Tracy?
Did you happen to say where it was? Location?
Council chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Braden. Mr. Bonsall?
Just a second. I was just hoping we could hear from you, Mr. President, about the committee of the whole meeting, when you might want to schedule it. Because, I mean, it sounds like dates are going quick, so.
Yeah, I have scheduled for November the 4th, Wednesday, 6 PM, right here. I will send out the agenda by the end of this week.
You said, I'm sorry, what time?
6. Any other new business? Mr. Gabbard?
First of all, I'd like to place into economic development the Pond Realty PUD, which is the VW, the Joseph VW. Place that into committee of the whole, if I could, please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Gabbard, did you say?
I'm sorry, into economic development.
Okay, so it's in economic development. Okay, thank you,
I
sir.
think we might have done that last time.
Yeah, I think that was in already. It's okay.
Yes. All right, and then follow up.
Yes, sir, Mr. Gabbard.
And if we could go ahead and call a meeting, and could we do it for 7:30 on that, after the Cal meeting, on next Wednesday, the 4th?
I love it.
Is that good? Super.
Just doubling up.
Yeah, thank you,
Great.
gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Any other new business? Mr. Tracy?
Sure. Since there's not a ton of people that follow my political page, I do want to throw a shout out to Public Works for the work they did last week regarding 2 trees that have been an absolute nightmare for a few streets. One, I never called about the tree. I never said anything about the tree. I don't know who called about the tree, but I've watched at least, personally, 4 big moving trucks get stuck underneath a tree on my street. And I know for a fact that the ladder truck was not going to make it under this tree branch. And I'm glad that the tree came down. Hopefully it'll be replaced at some point with a newer tree. But the concrete as well on the sidewalk has been damaged very bad due to the roots of that tree as well. So they took that tree down, and they did a great job, especially with the new employees that they have there. They took it down in very quick fashion and removed the remainder of it. They also took a dead tree down at the corner of Glenside and Fenwick that had the potential of liability to the city if it had fallen. So I'm glad that they got that tree taken down and done the same week. They did a phenomenal job.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Anyone else? Mr. Gabbard?
I'd like to go through and ask the mayor if, on Highland Avenue, the hillside, as you drive, it's really encroaching kind of into the lane. Just the weeds and stuff like that. I don't think our guys at Public Works have one of those, like, whatever you call it, where the arm that sticks out and can do it like that. So I thought I would just ask if we don't, which I'm pretty sure we don't, if maybe we could give them permission to rent one and just we can't take it all the way down because then we'll have mudslides again. But to be able to just at least knock it to where it's not impeding on the lane, just a thought.
Mayor Snyder?
Okay. We can look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Snyder. Thank you, Mr. Gabbard. Anyone else? Mr. Bonzo?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to refer to the committee of the whole, the topic of tax levies. Just request that be added to the agenda.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Any other new business? Then we'll move on. Item O, communications. We do not have any communications this evening. Item P, all members are present. Mr. Bonzo?
Sorry, you get to the next item.
Adjournment.
You're good. Okay, let's make sure. Yeah, I'd like to move that we adjourn.
Motion by Mr. Bonzo to adjourn. Second by Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Brady, please call the roll.
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Mr. Gabbard?
Yes.
Mr. Tracy?
No, it's too early.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson? Yes. Mr. Braden's a yes.
All members present voting, we have 6 yeses, 1 no. We are adjourned.